Hello everybody, my name is Julian Taylor and today I'm going to be talking about the Eurozone debt crisis. So the agenda for today, we're going to go through the timeline. The Eurozone debt crisis began in 2008, 2009 and it's still going on to this day. So we'll go through that and I'm going to go through a background of what it is and how it came about, the causes. We're going to look at Greece in detail because that was one of the first countries that kind of went way into debt and caused the biggest problems. We're going to look at some graphs and numbers so you can see the scale of how bad it actually is. And then cost to society / benefits, it's not really benefits, but we'll talk about the costs to society, and then the solutions or the proposed solutions, and then works cited. So to kick it off, the euro was introduced in 1999, and that's where, as it says there, the common currency known as the euro debuts in 11 countries. So before that, a lot of countries had their own currency, and then they went to one currency, which is the euro. And then so it all kicked off in 2008 when the Lehman Brothers. There was just a huge financial crisis in the US, and it affected Europe and the whole world basically. So that's when things started going wrong for all the economies. Greece's accounting unravels. So 2009, before that, they were covering up a lot of the debts that they were having, and they basically were way worse than everybody thought they were. Austerity measures are adopted. Greece Island are bailed out. That's 2010, so the crisis is spreading. Crisis deepens 2011. Permanent rescue fund is planned as European leaders look for resolution. So the problem just keeps getting worse and worse, as we'll talk about in later slides. And then countries and banks struggle to get balance sheets under control, so it's just contain the crisis. It just keeps getting worse. So background information. So in 2009, Greece debts reached 300 billion euros, which is a huge amount of their GDP. May 2nd, 2010, Eurozone members and IMF bail out Greece, so they put all this money to make sure that the country basically doesn't go under. Euro continues to fall. EU and IMF bail out Irish Republic, so they go under too. Debt crisis spreads and affects other economies, so all the countries in Europe, apart from Germany basically. And then 2011 of May, 78 billion euro bailout for Portugal too, so obviously they've got hit. And then Eurozone jobless rate hits new high. So the causes of the European debt crisis. So the first one is easy credit conditions from 2002 to 2008. This kind of ties in with the Lehman Brothers whole thing. Obviously, it was always the bubble was gonna burst eventually, and it really did burst in this situation. So, financial crisis from 2007 to 2008. The whole economy of the US mainly, but the planet basically, the whole world went way downhill. A Great Recession. Obviously, it's going to cause countries to go into debt, and it just got worse in this situation. And then EU member states failed to stay within Maastricht criteria. So the Maastricht Treaty was formed in 1992, and it was basically all the European countries would sign a treaty to say that they would have a fixed number of debts, and they wouldn't go over a certain spending limit and all this kind of thing. And there was basically a lot of false accounting going on in these different countries, so it was a lot worse than everybody was actually thinking it was. So countries masking their deficit and debt levels. So that's what they were doing. Instead of going through the Maastricht Treaty and actually abiding the rules, they were covering up the deficits and debt levels. So Greece was hit the worst probably out of anybody. That's during the crisis of 2007 to 2008. The main industries were shipping and tourism, so they were very sensitive to falls in the economy. So obviously they lost a lot of the income from tourism and shipping, mainly tourism. So they just basically were not doing good at all. So, and then Standard & Poor's slashes Greece's sovereign debt rating. So they slash it to BB plus or junk, fearing a default, which it was going to default unless the IMF and all these different banks stepped in, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But the stock markets were when euro currency declined massively, and Greece basically they couldn't, nobody wanted to buy any of the stock, and they just kept going downhill massively, basically. So seasonal adjusted unemployment rate grew from 7.5% in September 2008 to a record high of 27.9%. So that just gives you an idea of how bad the economy was, and obviously the unemployment rate's a huge indicator of how well the economy is doing and how well the country's doing overall. Total public debt is over 320 billion euros. That's in 2015. It was more than that. So here's a graph. Hopefully you can see it on there, but the debt in percent of GDP. So Greece is here. This is 1999, which is 94%, which is still higher than the Eurozone average. The green line is the Eurozone average, and then Greece is the blue line. Greece goes way up to 183% in 2015. So it's just, as you can see, it just rockets way up, and then that's 2011. They probably had the bailout then, so it goes down and just keeps going up and up and up. So creditors of Greece. So basically, these are the people who are holding the debt for Greece. So you've got ECB, which is the European Central Bank, European Union, Greek public funds, foreign state funds, IMF, which is International Monetary Fund, a bunch of banks here. There's loads of banks on there, which they're all holding the debt, and without them, the country would have gone under and had to. Well, it would have default, which that would have been even worse. Which we'll talk about that in 2 slides later. And then this is it in 2015. So EFSF is the European Financial Stability Fund, and they hold 131 billion euros. So that's obviously they've come in, they stepped in. That was created to help these countries out, to make sure they didn't collapse. So cost to society. So other countries that have been affected, and these countries have been required a bailout. Ireland, Portugal, Spain and Cyprus were just some of them. They have huge numbers of high unemployment. Spain was 16.1% unemployment rate, and the debt is 98.3% of GDP, and that's of March 2018. So these countries still have really poor economies, and they've still not recovered from this crisis. The European banks' losses approaching 1 trillion euros, that's a lot of euros, obviously. Huge debt, higher unemployment rates and poverty rates, just because the economies are struggling so bad. Germany estimated 9 billion. This is one thing I did find really interesting. So obviously all these countries are struggling, and investors are buying German federal bonds, which have got 0 interest or negative interest rates. So I found that amazing that Germany made so much money and all these countries are struggling, and Germany today is still doing really well. So I found that really interesting. Not really fair in my opinion, but there we go. And then contributing factor of Britain leaving the European Union was obviously because all these countries are doing so bad, and amongst other things, that was a decision that Britain chose to take to remove itself from the European Union. And then a future breakup of the Eurozone. This is one thing that I've found researching this topic, is a lot of questions whether the European Union is actually viable, because they don't have a central holding of all the money together. It's so countries, it's really spread out. So some countries are doing really well, and then others are doing terribly. So it's not really an even spread out currency. So the solutions. So these are some of the things that they've done, and some of the things that they are going to have been either done or they're going to try to do. So financial support measures. So that was the European Financial Stability Facility. So basically providing the funds to try and get these countries out of the huge amounts of debt. And then European Stability Mechanism, same thing. ECB, so that's European Central Bank, lowered interest rates and provided cheap loans, try and boost the economy and again lessen the debt. So this was an option, was to default Greece from the European Union, which what I read said it was a terrible option because it would cause hyperinflation in Greece and the whole economy would just go way downhill. And so Greece's debt to GDP ratio would go estimated to go over 200%, and it would just cause just horrendous problems in Greece. It's already bad, and it would have been even worse if they had a default. So that's why all these measures have been put in place to make sure they don't default. Have had to be done basically. And then the last one is Eurobonds. So each country's debt within the European Union will be guaranteed by another. So like countries who are doing better, so like Germany, some of the richer countries would pay more, and then the countries who are struggling would pay less to kind of even it out. But